Our speaker, Mr. Christopher Edling, was a Fulbright researcher in Kyrgyzstan. With that, please welcome Chris.
I got my own. Thank you. All right. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Look how friendly you are. I was told you're friendly, and they were right. We're going to be sort of like in the Central Asia neighborhood, which means we've got a lot of things going on, lots of different people, lots of different languages. So I feel like I should greet you with Здравствуйте, Russian, Salamat Sizbe, which is Kyrgyz. I'm from New York City, so I should say yo, my local dialect. I want to thank the Windham World Affairs Council for inviting me here today. It's a great pleasure to talk about Kyrgyzstan anytime I get a chance. I always do it with my students. And I want to thank Gordon and Jean also, who I was Peace Corps volunteer with in Armenia. And that's how this all sort of came about. So thanks to all of you. They mentioned I teach writing at NYU. Before I was at NYU, I was in Kyrgyzstan for 2 years. So my first year there, I was doing a Fulbright grant. I was researching bride kidnapping, which I'll talk about in a bit. I also spent 1 year working for the UN in Bishkek, which is a whole other topic that I don't think I have time to talk about today. But I thought I would try to start at the beginning. So as my mother said when I told her about my Fulbright, what the hell is Kyrgyzstan, and why on earth are you going there? As was mentioned, Kyrgyzstan is a landlocked country. It's just south of Kazakhstan. It's just north of Tajikistan. It's just to the west of China, which you may have heard of. And it's just to the east of Uzbekistan. So all of which is to say, anybody who's going to Kyrgyzstan is going there through somewhere else. And so today, we'll start with my own journey to Kyrgyzstan. Began 5 years earlier when I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Armenia. That's how I ended up going there. So here's the story. So in 2010, I was working as a Peace Corps volunteer. I was teaching English in a village, which is right there. That was the village I was in. It's called Khot, which is the Armenian word for grass. I was in Grass Village for 2 years. I taught English at this school, and the woman who was my teaching partner was a local Armenian gal. She was from the village, and she had just come back from university in the capital city where she finished her bachelor's degree. And when she moved back to the village, basically her high school boyfriend said, "Welcome back to the village. We're so happy you're back. I really want to get married to you." And she was like, "Thanks for welcoming me back. I have no interest in you. I don't want to get married." And he said, "That's fine. I'll just kidnap you into marriage." And so she was telling me about this, and I was like very, very confused about it because having no context for this. I'd heard a little bit about bride kidnapping from some other folks in my village. I'd already been in Armenia for about a year at this time, but I never really understood what bride kidnapping meant because it sounded like each story that I heard about it sounded kind of different. So as she was my friend and my teaching partner, I sort of had this front row view of watching the bride kidnapping attempts happening for, it was about 3-4 months. So very vividly, we were in class one day, it was September. Gosh, you could almost see the window of the classroom room. It was one of these windows over here. And a student messenger came to the classroom and said to my teaching partner, "You can't leave school after school gets out because this guy is waiting outside to kidnap you." And so we basically waited in the teacher's lounge at the school for a couple of hours. Eventually her family came. Her mom came and her cousin came and said, we're here to escort you home. We'll wait so this guy doesn't take you. And I saw all of this playing out over the course of several months. So September, October, November, December, she got engaged to another guy from another village. And once she got engaged, the kidnapping threats stopped, and she eventually got married to that guy. And they're still married. They've got 2 kids. But it really, witnessing this really got my attention, and it made me want to understand more about bride kidnapping. So I started talking to people in town, some of the students I was teaching, saying, what is this? Is this really kidnapping? What's going on? And I kept hearing all these different stories, and I was like, you know what, this is like really a lot more complicated than I initially realized. It seems like on the one hand, there are these cases like my teaching partner where she was really under threat of kind of like a violent, coercive, forced marriage. But at the same time, I was hearing all these other stories about so for example, a friend of mine who is a taxi driver in the village, he and his wife, now wife, they wanted to get married, but they didn't have enough money for a wedding. Weddings are very expensive in Armenia as they are in Kyrgyzstan, and they just sort of eloped. So he sort of, picked her up one night and they made off together in the night. And the elopement was referred to as a kidnapping. So it's kind of a fake kidnapping, not a real kidnapping, right? And so there's that pole, there's the elopement, and there's the really violent, horrible forced marriage. And then there's kind of everything in between, right? All these different stories. So being very intrigued by this, I decided to stay in Armenia for a third year after my first 2 years of Peace Corps and to do a proper study. So we did survey, interview project, just finding out what does this look like? Because when I went to the capital, I said, I approached NGOs, all these different organizations. I said, I'm really interested in bride kidnapping. What can you tell me about it? And they said, oh, well, we don't have bride kidnapping in Armenia. It doesn't exist, or it happened in the Soviet times, but it doesn't happen now. And I knew something was going on, right? So I talked to one guy who worked at the UN in the capital. He said, I'm from a village. We absolutely have bride kidnapping in Armenia. It's a really big problem. Nobody's talking about it. So if you want to stay and get some proper data, then that would be a great start, because at least then people are talking about it. So we did this survey and interview project and just got some statistics to figure out okay, what percentage of these marriages are kidnappings? Of those kidnappings, which ones are consensual elopements? If they are consensual, at what point does consent take place? That became its own very complicated thing. There's a lot I could say about bride kidnapping. I am writing a book about it. So if you're really interested in this topic, buy the book. It'll be out. So it just got more and more complicated, and I continued to do work on this when I was in graduate school. So after Peace Corps, I came back to the US. I did my master's degree at Columbia. I wrote my master's thesis about bride kidnapping. By the time I got to the end of my master's thesis, I realized there was really so much more that I wanted to learn about this. But I felt like I had kind of exhausted everything there was to learn in Armenia. And so I wanted to learn about a different context. And from my research, I had found out that bride kidnapping was happening all over the place, especially in certain former Soviet republics. So one of the places that popped up quite a lot was Kyrgyzstan. There had been quite a lot of scholarship, quite a lot of journalism coming out of Kyrgyzstan. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but there's this kind of reprehensible video that was put out by Vice, the media company Vice, which shows bride kidnapping in Kyrgyzstan. It's really awful. I'm just going to say that. It's really awful, just in the sense that the pitch of the Vice video is, look at these backwards people and all these backwards things that they do. And the truth is, bride kidnapping is this really much more complicated thing. And even the folks who are participating in the various kinds of bride kidnapping very often are doing so under pressures and in contexts that really are usually not explained and understood here, we'll say here in the United States, for example. And so one of the reasons I wanted to write a book was because I felt like the topic of bride kidnapping was so complicated that to really understand it, you had to understand everything that was going on around it, right? All of the financial pressures that were playing into that, all of the cultural pressures. For example, in Kyrgyzstan, there's a history of arranged marriage, and that has a relationship to bride kidnapping. In Armenia, there's not a history of arranged marriage, at least not recently. So I wanted to continue exploring bride kidnapping. It seemed like Kyrgyzstan was the place to do it. And so I applied for the Fulbright, I got accepted, and I went to Kyrgyzstan to continue my study of bride kidnapping. So, on we go to Kyrgyzstan, finally. So just a little bit of history. This is like, it's tough, right? Because like Central Asia, there is such a rich, complex history which could fill several volumes and has filled several volumes. But just sort of the quick overview. So Kyrgyzstan originally is not one homogeneous place. The word Kyrgyz, which is the demonym for Kyrgyz people, comes from the Kyrgyz word kurk, which means 40, because the Kyrgyz people are actually a union of 40 different tribes. Now, according to the epic Manas, so Manas is this guy right here on the horse. Manas is sort of lionized by the Kyrgyz people as being the first person to unite all of the 40 Kyrgyz tribes. The epic of Manas is oral history, which is passed down through the generations. I mean, it's at least 800 years old. That's a conservative estimate. It's probably much older. The people who perform the Manas epic are called Manaschis. They still have them in Kyrgyzstan today. It's really quite a thing. If you ever get a chance to look online, there are a lot of videos of Manaschis giving these very dramatic, epic renderings of the Manas history. So this guy who united the Kyrgyz tribes and fielded quite a lot of invaders over the course of hundreds of years. The first of which, who's traditionally mentioned in the Manas epic, are the Uyghurs. Actually. So Uyghurs are usually first mentioned, after Uyghurs the Mongols, the 13th century, and then after that it sort of becomes the province of the Manaschi to decide which invader he wants to put where in the history, but it was quite a lot of folks over the course of hundreds of years. Another great figure who's not pictured here, unfortunately, because I couldn't find a convenient photo, who is also a unifying force, is Kermanjan Datka. Kermanjan Datka was a female leader from the south, from the Alai region of Kyrgyzstan, and she also tried to unify quite a lot of the different Kyrgyz people right around the time that the Russian Empire was making its presence known. She convinced Kyrgyzstan basically to acquiesce and annex to what became the Soviet Union instead of continuing to fight. So she is now hailed as a great hero who basically saved the Kyrgyz people. Quite a lot of people believe that if the Kyrgyz had continued to fight, they would have lost and may have been wiped out. So she's held up as a huge hero as well. So Kyrgyzstan became part of the Soviet Union. It was a Soviet republic until 1991. The Kyrgyz relationship to the Soviet Union, as is the case throughout Eurasia, is a very complex one. So on the one hand, there are a lot of Kyrgyz folks today who remember the Soviet Union fondly. We had jobs. The Soviet Union brought industry and electricity to the region, and yet there's also this kind of backlash about we're trying to embrace our native Kyrgyz roots, go back to our traditions that we had before the Soviet Union, before the Russians. So this is made even more complicated by the fact that Kyrgyzstan is itself a very diverse place. So to take a contrast with Armenia, for example, Armenia today is something like 97+% ethnically Armenian. Armenian is spoken as a dominant language. The penetration of Russian language was never as strong in the Caucasus as it was in Central Asia. Kyrgyzstan, by contrast, is maybe about 65% ethnically Kyrgyz, and then the other 35% of the population is a quite diverse mixture of Uzbeks, ethnic Russians, Germans, Koreans, Dungans, Chechens. It's quite a complicated place. And there are sort of like geographic splits in the country. So in the north is where there are a lot of ethnic Russians. In the south of Kyrgyzstan is where there are a lot of ethnic Uzbeks. If you've heard A few things about Kyrgyzstan. You may have heard of the big riots in Osh in 1990, right around the time the Soviet Union was dissolving. There was quite vicious fighting between ethnic Kyrgyz and ethnic Uzbeks. Quite a lot of people were murdered. There's still quite a lot of ethnic tension in the southern part of the country. But yeah, it's like, yeah, it's a complicated place, you know. Language policy is very complicated. Which we may or may not have time to get to. All of which brings us up to the present day, which is to say that Kyrgyzstan, like so much of Eurasia, does sit at a real crossroads of trying to embrace and revive older traditions, such as bride kidnapping. Actually, one of the things that often comes up in discussions about bride kidnapping, people will defend it, including members of parliament openly have defended bride kidnapping as saying, this is our proud Kyrgyz tradition that we're trying to bring back. Now, historically, that's a bit of a dubious statement. There is a kind of elopement version of kidnapping, which certainly does exist historically with the consent of the woman. But this sort of like, you know, taking and running away with somebody against their own consent, by most historical records that I'm familiar with, that's a relatively new phenomenon. That did not exist historically. And we can imagine how it didn't exist historically, right? Because you can imagine if, like, let's say I'm a young Kyrgyz man, and there's a woman I want to marry, and if I just, you know, kidnap her and run off with her, the hell to pay, you know, by like her family and possibly her tribe, if she's from a different tribe or from a different village or something, would have been pretty fierce. So there's good reason to suggest that this non-consensual version of bride kidnapping, in fact, is not traditional, and it was not historically practiced, even though the rhetoric suggests otherwise. Okay, let's move on to some of the pretty pictures. The pretty pictures part of the presentation. So Kyrgyzstan is mountainous. More than 90% of the country is covered by mountains. The Tian Shan mountain range is the main one. It's the one that pushes northward up for the Himalayas. It is an absolutely breathtakingly beautiful country. There's quite a lot of skiing there. People come from all over the world to do mountaineering. This is a picture I took there's a city kind of in the south, in the center, called Toktogul, which is famous for its singers. They produce quite a lot of famous singers. And this is just a soccer pitch that happens to have these kind of dramatic mountains in the background. I was not athletic when I was younger. I remember thinking to myself, if my soccer field looked like that, I might have taken an interest in soccer. Kyrgyzstan is rich with gold. Mining has played a big role in recent Kyrgyz history, especially the recent presence of foreign companies coming in, companies from China and from elsewhere, trying to come and extract Kyrgyz gold. There's been a lot of politics around that, which could be its own whole other lecture. Because so much of Kyrgyzstan is at a high elevation, and because of all the mountains, it does have a lot of water, a lot of glaciers. And a lot of the glaciers, as I'm sure none of us in this room will be surprised to know, are melting right now. Climate change has had a huge effect on Kyrgyzstan. In the short term, it's produced a lot of hydroelectric power because of all the water that's been rushing down through the lakes and the streams. Water rights in Kyrgyzstan are very hotly contested because a lot of the water that starts its life in Kyrgyzstan ends up in other places around the region. So for example, in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, and actually there's quite a lot of fighting over who gets to use this water and who does it belong to. I was actually one of the gals who was in my Fulbright cohort is a lawyer, and that was her whole Fulbright project, was just how our water rights navigated in the region. But also it's a very beautiful place. So the urban-rural divide in Kyrgyzstan, as it was in Armenia, is quite stark. So the capital city of Bishkek has something like 1 or 1.2 million people in it. The total population of Kyrgyzstan is about 5 or 5.5 million. And most people do live in rural areas. So the picture here is of the National Philharmonic. This is our friend Manas at the front again. But like most people who live in Kyrgyzstan, their life doesn't really look like this. This would be like sort of a very traditional looking gate, opening into a housing compound. Quite a lot of people still live in temporary housing that was set up more than 10 years ago. Kyrgyzstan is considered one of the most open democracies in the region. Comparatively speaking, I mean, for the former Soviet Union, it does have a fairly open press corps. There tends to be less prosecution of journalists in Kyrgyzstan compared to Uzbekistan, for example. And so there is this kind of flow of information back and forth between the rural and the urban centers, which has made a big impact on bride kidnapping. So one of the big things plaguing bride kidnapping in Armenia is that there is this kind of this information disconnect between the rural areas where bride kidnapping usually happens and the capital cities where people who are in a position to address it may hear about it and do something about it. In Kyrgyzstan, there's quite a lot of information going back and forth. Social media has really taken off in Kyrgyzstan. There's a lot of internet penetration throughout the country. And so when people go online now and they say, I was bride kidnapped, millions of people might hear about it right away. And there could be public response to it. There's quite a lot of active public dialogue going on around bride kidnapping, which is one of the reasons I think it's become such a big issue here comparatively, and people aren't talking about it so much in other places. If that makes sense. How many people here have ever been in a yurt? Pretty good. Way better than New York City, let me tell you. How many of you have put together a yurt before? Very good. I like it. Cool. Well, for those of you who haven't had the pleasure, I wanted to bring in some photos just to show, in Kyrgyzstan anyway, how the yurts are generally constructed. So these sort of like long pieces of wood which tend to bend. They're treated to bend, and they're lashed together with these sort of like long ribbon-like threads. And I wanted to show, so this is the shadow of the crosshatch. That's at the very top of the yurt, which is in fact the Kyrgyz national symbol that's on the flag. So if you ever see the Kyrgyz flag, that's where that comes from. Music is taken quite seriously throughout the country, both in urban and rural areas. So the two national instruments that I wanted to highlight for the presentation tonight are the komuz and the temir komuz. So temir means iron. So the komuz is this three-stringed, I think it's closely related to a lute, as I understand. This is a friend of mine, her daughter, playing it. It's very common for young children to have komuz lessons. I mean, even in the most remote villages, even when families are struggling financially in a quite severe way, very often students will still have education playing the komuz. The other instrument that's very common is the temir komuz, or sort of like a mouth harp. Sort of thing. And I mean, if we're thinking back to the nomadic history of Kyrgyzstan, right? So it wasn't really until the Soviet Union that quite a lot of Kyrgyz people became settled and agricultural. So most of the history was Kyrgyz people roaming all over Eurasia. So it's suggested genetically that quite a lot of the Kyrgyz tribes are ethnically Turkic. And they roamed as far as into Siberia and the Altai Mountains, and pushing west towards Turkey. But if you're on foot, or if you're on hoof, right, it makes sense to have some musical instruments that travel well. And you can't really see here, the komuz is this very sort of lithe, long instrument. It doesn't weigh but a few pounds. And of course the mouth harp is just this tiny little thing. So they both travel very well. And it's very common to hear people playing them well, kind of all over the place. I mean, especially in villages. I felt like I came across people playing them in villages a lot. There's a great, there are a couple of great videos online which I highly recommend. One of them is the World Nomad Games are played in Kyrgyzstan, and there's a video of a recent World Nomad Games where they actually assembled 1,000 people playing komus all together at the same time. It's unreal. I mean, if you get a chance to see it, I highly recommend watching it. It's totally worth it. Another video that's worth seeing is there's this Kyrgyz, like a national Kyrgyz group. They compose a lot of original music in a traditional style. They're called Ordo Sahna. So if you look them up, their music is really wonderful. They perform here in the US quite a lot, and they collaborate with Western artists a lot. Okay. So pitching back to the yurts, so you have to have some sort of flooring, right, for the yurt. And the most traditional flooring is called a sherdok. Sherdok is a kind of rug. It's made from a sort of like a felted wool, and these are really, really beautiful ones. I actually took pictures of these at the National Museum. They're really exquisite. So the way it's made is the wool is made out and pressed into these long sheets, and then the designs are cut out and they're dyed. And so you can sort of see that, you know, this was like a green one and a white one, and the patterns are sort of laid on top of one another and inverted. And so you can get, you know, there's a sister to this one somewhere that has white on the inside and green around here. So it's both a very efficient way of making rugs. They're very tough, they're very durable. The way of making the dyes has changed over the years. It used to be from a lot of like, you know, sort of natural dyes, and today it's more synthetic. But yeah, they're very pretty. These are easy to find, by the way, if you're interested in, like, I don't know, having one for your home. They're easy to find and order online. And the symbols all have different meanings. I don't know all of them. I know a couple of them that are represented here. So this design here, I don't know, well, you can see it because it's not huge. Let me see if there's one on the next slide. Yeah, this is a much better version of it, actually. So this shape here is this vessel for drinking, which you would hold with two hands, and it has the mare's milk, the horse milk in it, and it has these two handles which sort of curve up, and the reason for that is because the germ for the fermentation stays in one of those handles. So when you drink it like this, but there's always a little bit of it that stays in. It stays in the handle because it becomes fermented. So that's the one design I know. The other one is this one here, this sort of like border going around here. This is meant to be like waves of water. I don't know this for a fact, but I'm going to bet that this sherdok probably was made in the region of Issyk-Kul, which is the big lake in Kyrgyzstan. So I'm only saying that because I've never seen a sherdok with that design that was not from the lake region. So it's a bit of a guess, but all of the symbols actually have meanings and different histories behind them. Those are the only two I know off the top of my head, but they're really beautiful. I love these. I got a bunch of these when I was in Kyrgyzstan. So in terms of dress, there's the famous sort of national hat for men is called a kalpak. In Kyrgyzstan, they wear what's called the ak kalpak. Ak is the Kyrgyz word for white. So you see all of these hats are white. And the size actually does matter in this case. So the taller a kalpak is, the higher the standing of the person who's wearing it. So you would usually see older people wearing much, much taller kalpaks, and younger guys would be wearing little tiny ones. The one I'm wearing in this picture is a bit outsized for me. I should be like 40 years older to be wearing this. But they are for sale everywhere. They're very commonly given as gifts, especially to like people who are visiting from outside the country. I was given many kolpaks when I was in Kyrgyzstan. And this is held as like a national symbol. This is actually like a bus stop, which they designed the roof to look like a kolpak. This is in the southern part of the country in Jalalabad region. Yeah, they take the kolpak seriously, as well they should. So, food. You guys all had snacks already, right? This isn't going to be torture, because I got a lot of food pictures. Okay. Kyrgyz are traditionally nomad. Quite a lot of the staples of the diet are breads, which could be made quickly, and meat. So we're going to focus on those first. This is sort of a style of bread which you may have seen in places outside of Kyrgyzstan also. In Uzbekistan, it's very common, actually throughout the former Soviet Union. It's this like lipyoshka style of bread, also called naan. So it's fluffy, it is leavened, but it's, oh God, I had such an addiction to this when I was there. They also make samsas. So samsa is kind of like something like a dumpling. It's usually stuffed with meat. This particular one, I was having in Osh, which is in the southern part of the country. It's a very Uzbek-heavy neighborhood. This is like Uzbek-style samsa. It usually will have sheep meat in it, although sometimes there's also beef. And there's some other things too. I had really good ones with pumpkin also, which is very tasty. The tea, which you see here, so this is a pretty good shot actually. So this is the mare's milk. This is tea. The tea is usually served in a small bowl, which I've come to believe is a far superior way of drinking tea, because when you hold the tea in your hand, you know how hot it is. And anytime when I was in Kyrgyzstan, I never had this experience of having a mug of tea and like burning my mouth, because as soon as I picked it up, if it was hot, I dropped it and I didn't drink it. The other food item I wanted to highlight here is called borsak. It's kind of a fried little pillow of dough. They're just about that big. Here, this is a very civilized table that was laid out in a very formal way. But usually, when Kyrgyz folks eat on the ground, they'll sort of lay out a blanket and just throw the borsak everywhere, and it'll be all over the place, which I think is fun. And it's very accessible, right? If you've got 12 people sitting around, everybody can easily grab at it. Yeah, it's totally addictive and wonderful. Okay, so the meat-based stuff, I mean, samsas are meat-based too, but so this is plov, which you've probably also heard of from other areas. So I think the biggest contrast to Kyrgyz-style plov, which is like the rice, like pilaf, would be Uzbek style. So in Kyrgyzstan, plov is usually made with some sort of meat and onion and carrots. So maybe beef or sheep or horse, although horse a little less so today. It's very tasty. Plov, by the way, just as a brief gender aside, because I always want to talk about gender. Plov is a dish that is traditionally made by men, and men tend to take a lot of pride in their plov. This plov was made by my friend's cousin, who, like many Kyrgyz men I knew, claimed to have the best plov in all of the country. He may have been right. What do I know? This is dimdama, which is a kind of like boiled meat with vegetables, usually with cabbage and peppers. And these are the unfortunate victims of probably what produced both of these. There are quite a big like sweets play a prominent role in Kyrgyz food, both in terms of like baked cookies, crackers, chocolate, this sort of thing, as well as different kinds of fruit, both fresh fruit and dried fruit. I would say this table here, which has like homemade jams and honey, watermelon, cookies, sugar cubes, all of the dried fruits here. This was a very common scene, especially when I was traveling in the south. Actually, a lot of tables look like this, which made me happy. This was a Kyrgyz sort of snack. It's called kurut. Kurut is dried yogurt balls. They're very salty. I love them. It is this kind of food that, like, a bit of an acquired taste. I brought a big bag of these back with me when I moved home from Kyrgyzstan, and this was like I don't want to say like a practical joke, but it was like a bit of a barometer for saying, like, here's this Kyrgyz food, and they put it in their mouth and just sort of watch the facial expressions. Because what does dried yogurt ball taste like? Who knows, right? You don't really know until you pop it in your mouth. It's very salty. There are a few different types. These are kind of the traditional white ones. They're about this big. They make them as big as this or as small as this. There's a brown one, which is made with butter, which has a much less salty, kind of a mild flavor. And there's a red one, which is made with pepper, red pepper, which is, yeah, it's a lot. In terms of beverages, kumis is the mare's milk. This was fresh mare's milk that had just been drawn when I was traveling in kind of a rural area. It's not easy to find. Like, even in Kyrgyzstan, where it is sort of this proud national thing, you have to go out of your way to get it. And the fresher it is, the better. If you can sort of get it just after it's been taken from the horse, that's definitely the best. Has anyone had kumis, mare's milk?
I don't recommend it. Yes.
So you're the same one who built the yurt, right? Are you Kazakh? Okay, yeah. I rather like the kumis. This is another one of these things, like, I think maybe a bit of an acquired taste. The other thing I wanted to highlight, not that vodka is unique to Kyrgyzstan at all, but there's this way that vodka is sold in Kyrgyzstan. It's called juice gram. So juice is the Kyrgyz word for 100, and gram is gram. So it's 100 grams of, like, jet fuel level vodka that people just tear off like kind of like a Jello, like, little cup and just shoot it. It's quite an experience. Just to quickly kind of to mention the religion thing, just because this is something that comes up quite a lot in international news about Kyrgyzstan. So, historically, in modernity, quite a lot of Kyrgyz people do identify as Muslim. As the Soviet Union was sort of suppressing quite a lot of religion, there were folks who, stopped worshiping or observing or kind of did so very quietly. But after the Soviet Union ended, there's been this embrace of Islam, but not evenly and not across the country. It's actually become a very complicated issue because on the one hand, Kyrgyzstan is a place where Islamic extremism is thought to be, there's potential for that. In fact, when I was traveling through the south and I was doing my interviews about bride kidnapping, I met a guy who had been recruited for the Taliban. And he was very like sweet, kind of soft-spoken guy, and he's laughing and talking about how the people came to the mosque and were recruiting and all this sort of thing. And that is happening in parts of the country, legitimately. But at the same time, the government of Kyrgyzstan has taken quite a harsh stance in putting down anything that smacks of extremism. In fact, Kyrgyzstan's government got a slap on the wrist from Human Rights Watch for being maybe a bit too aggressive in putting down potential extreme Islam. So I just have pictures here. This is like a very, very small mosque in a rural area, and this is a Christmas tree in the capital. As in so much of the region. Especially like ethnic Russians will observe Christmas. There are quite a lot of Christians in Kyrgyzstan. For example, the ethnic Korean population in Bishkek identifies overwhelmingly as Christian, and this is like, this was put up by the city. So yeah, it's, there's a lot going on. I've had a lot of interesting conversations with Kyrgyz folks about religion, as I did in Armenia about Christianity. So in terms of, looking to the future of Kyrgyzstan, and I'll hedge what I'm saying because I was there, I've been back now 2 years, and Kyrgyzstan is a place in rapid transition. To speak specifically to the bride kidnapping issue, this is a great kalpak, by the way. Very classy wedding kalpak he's wearing. There's every reason to suggest empirically that bride kidnapping is probably not going to continue to be practiced. There have been major political and legal campaigns, also things on social media, people speaking out against bride kidnapping. There is this funny thing that happened where, so rule of law in Kyrgyzstan is not especially effective. Just because something is illegal doesn't mean that people don't do it. So bride kidnapping, for example, has been illegal in Kyrgyzstan since forever. The same is true in Armenia, but that doesn't mean anything necessarily if it doesn't get enforced. Now, a few years ago, Kyrgyzstan upped the penalty, the criminal sentence for bride kidnapping by several years. And what the NGOs who were researching this found was not that people started going to jail more often, but they found that the bribe that people paid to get out of going to jail went up because the sentence got higher, and that had sort of like a deterrent effect on bride kidnapping. So that's a good thing in its way. Also, there is quite a lot of there's a strong feminist movement happening in Kyrgyzstan right now. Those of you who listen to NPR may have recently, in the last few months, heard of Zir Asylbek, is kind of a famous Kyrgyz singer, and she has this feminist song that went viral, and it's causing a lot of upheaval and discussion in Kyrgyzstan. People saying, well, women shouldn't be saying that or shouldn't be doing this and that. In any case, the good thing about it is that people are talking. It's out there, right? People are talking about it for better or for worse. There is a lot of really beautiful public art in Kyrgyzstan. This is the only one I managed to fit into the slideshow, which shows a woman. The model for this is the famous heroine Jamelia. Jamelia is the title character in a novella by Chingiz Aytmatov, who's, I think, the most famous international Kyrgyz writer. And she's holding like an Apple computer here. But yeah, I haven't been back in a couple of years. I think, my sense is if I go back to visit in a couple of years, I expect to see things having changed already a lot in just those 4 or 5 years. I think that's true in Armenia too, the last time I've been back there. But I think maybe I'll hold. I hear you all are engaged and maybe have all sorts of questions. So this is Rahmat, which is thank you in Kyrgyz, Spasiba, which is thank you in Russian. If we do have any Kazakhs in the room, this would be Rahmet. So Kazakh and Kyrgyz are pretty close. They're mutually intelligible by and large. But thank you so much. And I welcome all questions and comments, please. And I think there's a microphone going around.
As usual, I have to make a very polite request.
Just pass that to him.
Please make your question brief so everybody gets a chance to ask their question and get
My camera over there. So if you could just
Thank
step
you.
back.
Please raise your hand for the question. Right there. Go ahead.
In the back?
Yep.
You walk in the microphone back.
No, you're good.
I'm good? Okay.
If you don't mind grabbing this there.
Thank you.
It's just allow people to hear you.
Okay, thank you. In your image of the yurt, with the shadow of, when I saw that, it made me think of the sun. And then you said it's on their national flag.
Right.
So I'm wondering, was the year designed to have, in fact, a sun symbol? And from that would come the question, was the religion based on sky and sun?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I don't know. The first question I don't know. That might be true, and certainly, this is very sun-like, right? And so I definitely get the question. The religious history of Kyrgyzstan, like the religious history of Armenia, is this sort of like development of quite a lot of like animism and pagan beliefs which then, I forget what century it was that Islam came to the region, but my understanding of it, and I'm not a scholar of religion, but my understanding is that there is this kind of grafting on of like, what a lot of people believed and worshipped before Islam came, and that is quite frankly still practiced today. So for example, even in a barber shop in the capital city, like in a very urbane place, it would be very common to see folks like kind of purifying the space by burning some sorts of branches, which, most of the people I talk to anyway suggest that has nothing to do with anything related to Islam, but is kind of connected to this prior sorts of like worship of like nature and all of this kind of thing. So my guess, because this is outside of my wheelhouse, I won't make any claims to knowing what I'm talking about, but my guess is that's probably true, and there's probably something to that. I did meet quite a lot of folks in Kyrgyzstan who were sort of as proud and as quick to talk about the pre-Islamic Kyrgyz traditions as who were proud to talk about Islam. And so like being close to nature or worshiping the sun or something like this would have been part of that, I think. So my answer is kind of pure speculation, but yeah, my sense is there's probably something to that.
What prompted my question was that with the Native American teepee, that was extracted from their connection and religion to the natural world. So it seemed possible here.
I will say, to speak to that specifically, quite a lot of Kyrgyz folks who I met have a great deal of interest in Native American tribes. There are a lot of folks who believe like, oh yeah, that's us, they're us, who sort of walked across the land bridge. So like actually I met a couple of scholars at the university whose entire scholarship was devoted to studying the comparisons between Native American cultures and Kyrgyz cultures, especially the ancient Kyrgyz cultures, because they're, so for example, in Afghanistan, there are ethnic Kyrgyz who actually speak a slightly different version of Kyrgyz, which is considered older, and who have maintained what is considered to be older rituals and culture and all of that sort of thing. And the parallels between those Kyrgyz cultures and certain tribes in the Americas seem to be quite strong. So take that for what it's worth. But I can just say as a lay observer, I heard quite a lot of it about that while I was there.
Thank you, Chris. It's a very informative talk.
Thanks.
By the way, if you'd want to have your house smoked here, it could be arranged very easily in Brattleboro.
Thank you.
They use sage.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Oh, I'm originally from Colorado. They use something different there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my question is, economically, strategically, what's driving the economy and where is Kyrgyzstan going? And who do they align with? Are they Chinese aligned, Russian aligned, the stands aligned? Where are they going?
So the economy question, They are trying to grow tourism, and rightly so. I mean, my God.
Yeah.
It's like one of the most beautiful countries I've ever visited in my life. Not that I'm the most well-traveled person in this room, but like it's stunning. Like the landscapes there are amazing. They're trying to build up tourism. Similar to Armenia, there's this growing sort of tech, trying to build a tech boom. I mean, based on the sort of like physics-heavy education, which was present during the Soviet Union. So tech, Mining is a complicated one. This is transitioning to your next question about who do they lean towards. In the last 10 years, there's been increasing interest from China, and Kyrgyz folks have sort of mixed feelings about this because, like, I mean, those of you who are familiar with like sort of Soviet history and post-Soviet history, this idea of the Great Game, right? That there are sort of these big forces of gravity which just sort of pull everything in the region. So Russia is one of them, China is one of them, the U.S. is one of them. Kyrgyzstan is relatively Western-leaning. Among the republics, certainly because of where they are. They don't, I mean, a lot of people complain that if a bill gets passed in Russia, 6 months later, the same bill gets passed in Kyrgyzstan, and there's some truth to that. That's definitely true of attitudes towards LGBTQ communities in the region. Months after sort of the gay propaganda bill passed in Russia, a similar one passed in Kyrgyzstan. So there's that. But yeah, growing economic interest from China for sure. But I mean, in the region, in this, the sort of stands, the collection of stands, Kyrgyzstan is considered sort of a Western stronghold. So we, the United States, had a big Air Force base. Manas Air Force Base was there. It closed some years ago. The U.S. Embassy in Kyrgyzstan is kind of like, they maintain very, very strong ties. I mean, much stronger than other countries. I mean, stronger than Turkmenistan, for example, or Uzbekistan. Yeah, they're relatively Western-leaning, and a lot of freedom of press, all of that sort of thing, that is thought to align more with kind of like Western values. I think by most political indices, I think Kyrgyzstan is considered the most stable and open democracy in the region. So for whatever that's worth.
Thank you.
Yeah. I don't know who has the microphone.
You spoke of food, and I love food.
Oh yeah, my brother, me too.
I have two quick questions.
Yeah.
One is that, what was your favorite food? And the second one is, what would you recommend for a tourist to, what is the most important thing to do there or to take advantage of?
Do you eat meat?
Yes.
You do eat meat.
No pork though.
Huh?
No pork.
No pork. That's fine. They don't eat pork either. If you're going, let me take the second one first. If you're going as a tourist, there is something I don't have a picture of here. It's called beshbarmak. It literally comes from the word for 5 fingers. It's this kind of noodle dish with horse meat on it. If there are any Kyrgyz people in the room, don't get mad at me for saying this. The best beshbarmak I ever had was in Kazakhstan, actually. They make it there also. But it's this noodles and horse meat that you eat with your hands. Just because, like, I think that's worth having at least once. It's good. No, I say that with genuine appreciation. I love it. It was so good. But yeah, I mean, the other thing I would say, it's like if you're a tourist, I guess this is like stock tourism advice, but like get outside of Bishkek. I mean, I think a lot of tourists just stay in Bishkek, the capital city, and there's a lot of great stuff to see. There's a lot of great food in Bishkek too. But if you can get to the south, to Osh and Jalalabad, I mean, there's a kind of style of like the samsa and the plof, which you'll more find in the south. So that's what I would say is like go to the south and eat, just because the food will be very different than it is in the north. My personal favorite food, my God.
Yogurt balls?
That's what I'll tell my friends when they come to visit me. I don't have a picture of it here. There's this type of samsa that's only made once a year for Nowruz, the Persian New Year, which is one of the biggest calendar celebrations. It's a type of samsa they put, I don't know what the mixture of spices is, but they only make it on Nowruz, and it's delicious. It's really good, and they serve it with this, there's this kind of like millet drink that's also only made that time of the year. I have a picture of it somewhere here. It's not in my slide presentation. If you go around Persian New Year, yeah, that's my personal favorite. I would wait all year for that to come just so I could eat that samsa. There's another thing that I can't believe I didn't talk about here. There's a fermented drink called bozo, like the clown, but it's like a half fermented drink made from grain. You can't really buy it in the store. You can only buy it from like little old grandmothers who are like on the street who are selling it in like recycled Coca-Cola bottles. That stuff is really good. It will not make you drunk. You'll have like lots of Kyrgyz friends who they'll drink like a sip and it's like, oh, I'm so drunk. It's like, that's kombucha. You're not drunk. But yeah, bozo is also good. My favorite is probably that Nowruz samsa, for sure. Sorry, I could talk about food all night. I have an Italian mother. I'm like very, very big into the food. Nah. Yeah.
Two questions, please. Before it became Muslim, was the predominant religion Buddhism, as it was in parts of Western China? And second, what is the role of corruption these days? You mentioned that the government doesn't necessarily enforce everything, but bribes can be taken.
So the religion thing, like I'm hedging a little bit on the religion questions just because it's not my area of scholarship. I don't know of any widespread practice of Buddhism.
Can I add something?
Yeah. No, please.
The religion was Zoroastrian.
Yeah.
The celebration of Nowruz is in 21 countries, and Kyrgyzstan is one of them. These are the people who have been celebrating Nowruz, the New Year, in the same tradition for 3,000 to 4,000 years. And they spoke Zoroastrian and ancient Persian language before the Arab invaded and converted them to Islam, like many other countries. So this is
Yeah.
Here you are.
Yeah. Thank you. And speaking of, by the way, Nowruz and Zoroastrianism, so the country just south of Kyrgyzstan is Tajikistan. Tajik language is very close to Persian. There's quite a long history stretching back there. So like ethnically, like Kazakhs and Kyrgyz are ethnically very closely related. The languages are also very close. They're both Turkic. And you see also a different appearance. Like Kyrgyz and Kazakhs look more like Mongolian, whereas Tajiks look more Persian. And the corruption question. I mean, it's a post-Soviet rodeo, you know? If you get pulled over for a speeding ticket, you're likely just going to pay a bribe to the police officer. You're not going to get a ticket, unless they're really trying to throw the book at you for some reason. It kind of affects everything. I mean, I think my folks who work in like the NGO sector or development, you know, corruption is cited as the big thing. It's the big issue. In Kyrgyzstan, in quite a lot of Eurasia, like post-Soviet Eurasia, in terms of like bills getting held up in Congress, in terms of people not going to jail. There's a very famous story of a guy who kidnapped a woman, and this is really horrible. This happened recently. So this guy kidnapped a woman. They were arrested. They were taken to a police house, and at the police station, this guy was left alone in a room with the woman and murdered her. And he did not go to jail. I mean, it happened in the police station, right? And this guy wasn't, got off the hook. So, like, to tell a kind of a funnier story of corruption, when I was in Armenia, and Armenia is not the same as Kyrgyzstan, but they do share a bit of this post-Soviet history and the post-Soviet corruption. So I was at a birthday party with for the same gal who was under siege of kidnapping, and there was a teacher there a woman of my mother's age, who I had filled in for at her school while she was having a surgery. And I hadn't seen her for months. And I saw her at the birthday party. I went up to her and said, "Hey, how are you?" Whatever, whatever. She introduced me to her husband. I said, "Nice to meet you." And then I just went off and just enjoyed the party. At the end of the night, this guy came up to me, this guy who's of my father's age, and he said, "Do you know who I am?" And I said, "Yeah, I know, you're her husband. We met inside." He's like, "Yeah." And he punched me in the face. And I was like, what's going on? I was so confused, right? More confused than angry. And my friend, who was the one who was going to get kidnapped, she was like laughing. She's like, "Come inside, I'll explain to you what's going on." So I was like, "Yes, please." So she's like, "I think he saw that you knew his wife and he got angry." I was like, "I do know his wife. I'm like her colleague, And she was like, "Yeah, but like Armenian men are very jealous and possessive and all this kind of thing." And I was like, "Yeah, okay." Like, I don't know what to do, right? If I'm in the US and if somebody punches me in the face in public, I mean, one of two things is going to happen, right? You're going to be like, "Well, if I wanted to kiss, I would have asked your mother," right? Or I call the police. And so I asked her, I said, "Should I call the police?" She's like, "Chris, he's police. The guy who punched you is police." Yeah. So I was like, all right. But yeah, I mean, like the corruption thing, it's hard to quantify it because it does sort of touch everything. And it's one of these things that's sort of like, it's like a magnetic field, right? Like the fact that bride kidnapping keeps going on, like, is because nobody's afraid of retribution. Nobody's afraid of like being prosecuted for it. So yeah. I just like to tell the story of getting punched in the face. It's one of my favorite Peace Corps stories.
I wanted to ask about your research and your methodology, which sort of touches on both of these recent questions, because if you're researching something that's officially illegal, and you're also researching in a context in which, as you say, there were people who, would be robbed and whatever, how did you go about finding, there must be very many layers that you have to go down through to get any kind of verifiable information. So I'm just curious how you went about it.
Yeah, I mean, like, yes and no, and the methodology was different in my two research sites. So I'll start with Armenia. So Armenia is where we did sort of the proper survey and interview project. So that was, I was placed at a women's center, and we got some grant money, and we designed the survey tool, actually designed it under the tutelage of a guy who had researched bride kidnapping in Kyrgyzstan, who very kindly helped us out. So we designed the survey tool, and then there was a question in the survey, like, if you had been bride kidnapped, are you willing to give an interview? And quite a lot of people did. The truth is, like, yeah, it's illegal, but like everybody if you're in a village, everybody knows that it's happening. And we did sometimes come across folks who didn't want to talk about it. Maybe they were afraid, like, X person is going to hear about it and there's going to be consequence. But no, quite a lot of people spoke openly about it. I think, there was some sense, especially like for me coming in as a foreigner, and like my positionality in relation to all of this is questionable in the extreme, which is a whole other thing. But like, I think there were, like, a lot of people wanted to talk to us. This was true when I went to Kyrgyzstan too. So in Kyrgyzstan, because so many people had been researching bride kidnapping already for several years, I had no reason to, and I didn't really have the toolkit to go in and start doing original research of that kind. So when I got to Kyrgyzstan, instead of doing surveys, in that kind of quantoid sort of area, I just tried to take as many interviews as I could. And I talked to as many different people who might have been involved in bride kidnapping from different vantage points. So I talked to police officers, and I talked to politicians and lawyers, and obviously lots of people who themselves had participated in bride kidnapping, and family members and parents of people whose children had been part of bride kidnapping, clerics and all sorts of folks, and people who had studied it, like anthropologists. But to be honest with you, like, I didn't face a lot of pushback. If anything, a lot of people were very eager to talk to me.
So were women, did you have a sense that the women could really say, or did they go along with whatever the family around them believed was proper to say?
Yeah, it was case to case. I mean, when we did interviews with women, like, it was generally done like in private with confidentiality, and it did happen. Like, if we would interview like the husband and the wife separately, right? Those two stories could sound very different, right? Unsurprisingly, I suppose. Yeah.
Well, our first, our first exposure to Kyrgyz cultures was through films. It's our nonprofit, which is with often collaborates with Windham World Affairs Council. We received some films from Kyrgyzstan through the Central Asian cinema.
Oh.
And so, like some films, I'm just wondering, culture question. Did you see films when you were there? Was that interesting to you? I know food is the most important, so I'm just wondering.
Yeah.
I've only seen just a few. Bashkember, maybe you've heard of it, and
yeah.
A couple of old black and white ones from the Soviet era. I'm just wondering, what's your experience of films? Anything about that, about Kyrgyz culture?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I did. I mean, in relation to bride kidnapping, I saw quite a lot of films. So one thing that's interesting is, like, so Kyrgyzstan actually has quite an active, it's not like Bollywood, but it's like, there is like this very active domestic film scene. And bride kidnapping features quite prominently into a lot of the movies that come out. I'm saying like contemporary film, right? But it's a lot of like slapstick comedy. So like bride kidnapping will be at the, actually I have a whole chapter about this in my book. So bride kidnapping will be at the center of a lot of these like zany, low budget Kyrgyz comedies. Several of them are released every year. I saw enough to last a lifetime. But aside from that, I don't know if you get your hands on the state-funded film about Kermanjan Datka. It's a really lovely film, very well made, a great rendering of her story. And Bolsulkin is another great Kyrgyz film that I would recommend. Yeah, it's not like, yeah, there are good Kyrgyz films. There are, I guess is true in lots of places. There are lots more like kind of cheesy sort of Kyrgyz films. I'm calling cheesy because they're like goofy, zany. Yeah.
It's fascinating. It's really fascinating. I want to ask you two questions. One, you taught as a Peace Corps. You taught English.
Yeah.
And is this in the college or in K-12? But what level did you teach?
Yeah. So the first 2 years I was a Peace Corps volunteer. I taught in this is our village school. So in Armenia, students start learning English from 3rd grade. So in our school, we had from 3rd graders until 11th graders. There were only 11 forms at that time. So I taught there, but I also in town, I taught at the local college. So and adults at the Women's Center. So at all levels, I guess.
And among the students, are there more men and women? What's your ratio? And what is the role of the women in society? Do they get a job, or they study to get a job, or to get married, or how do you see?
Armenia or Kyrgyzstan, or both?
Kyrgyzstan.
I would say, I mean, I did do some work in Kyrgyz schools when I was there. That was part of like my another part of my Fulbright. I did a lot of teacher trainings. Gender ratio seemed pretty even up until you got to college. At college, it's split a little bit. Just there is like this heavy like tech, like physics, engineering did tend to be very male heavy, whereas like a foreign language department tended to be more female. So I guess there is that gender divide, which is maybe not surprising. And then, what was the other thing you asked? Oh, the role. Yeah, so this is another thing. So Kyrgyzstan, I think coming from the US, it's easy to look at Kyrgyz culture and see ways that, women seem to have maybe like somehow like a submissive role and are sort of, men are in a lot of dominant, prominent positions. There's definitely like, domestic labor, women tend to be, inside in the house, in the kitchen space and taking care of children. Men tend to be, doing more like outside work. But employment-wise, no, there are a good number of Kyrgyz women who are educated and who work. There are a lot of Kyrgyz men who leave Kyrgyzstan and are migrant workers in Russia. That was true in Armenia too. So the gender balance actually shifts a little bit once you get past the age of 25. Like in Kyrgyzstan, as in Armenia, there are a lot of villages where there are very few men because the men have left to go work somewhere else. So there's that. There are also, as part of our bride kidnapping research, we saw that there were cases where like a man would kidnap a woman who maybe is in college and doesn't want her to continue her education. And that definitely happens sometimes. And sometimes like deals are sort of struck with the families. Like once the families get involved after the bride kidnapping, a family might say like, okay, like she'll stay as your wife, but she has to finish college first, right? Something like this. So that will come into bargaining sometimes. Yeah, gender roles in Kyrgyzstan, it's they're actually very proud of how strong and prominent their women are, and I get that in context, and there's a lot more I could say about that. Yeah, for sure.
Just have 4 more short questions. And I've got you in mind.
Make it short. So Kyrgyzstan has been independent for almost 30 years. Did you get a sense whether the national language has been strengthened, and is there a sort of a national dialect? And for example, is higher education carried on in the local language? And what is the position of Russian language now in Kyrgyzstan? And whether the sort of pan-Turkic culture is reaching them, and what are their ties with, say, Istanbul?
Oh yeah. Well,
maybe just pick 1 or 2 of those questions.
Yeah.
There's about 4 or 5 in there.
Yeah. Language policy is complicated. So, like in Kazakhstan, Kazakhstan is a wealthier nation than Kyrgyzstan is, and has been able to pull away from Russia partially for that reason. And so Kazakh language has been elevated in Kazakhstan, most notably by the recently deceased president in Kazakhstan. Now in Kyrgyzstan, there is a similar push, but it's harder to get off the ground, partially because Kyrgyzstan is a little more like economically and politically overshadowed by Russia. So there was recently an initiative in Kyrgyzstan that civil servants had to take a test in Kyrgyz, which was seen as like a bit of a political red herring. Because the truth is, like, there are lots of people in Kyrgyzstan who are not ethnically Kyrgyz, and it's very, very rare to find somebody who's not ethnically Kyrgyz who speaks Kyrgyz. So like an ethnic Russian likely does not speak Kyrgyz. It's not spoken in their home, never was, going back generations. So yes, there is some grumbling about that. When I was in Kyrgyzstan, I studied Russian. I didn't study Kyrgyz, and the reason I did that is because Russian still is very much like the common tongue that unifies sort of all these different people, like Uyghurs and Dungans, and people who do have like lots of different backgrounds. But yeah, there's a lot of Kyrgyz people would like to see Kyrgyz language take a more prominent position. I don't know. I don't know if it's going to get off the ground anytime soon. Not until they have more money like Kazakhstan does.
Don, right, George.
You mentioned that there are ethnic Koreans in Kyrgyzstan, and I remember reading somewhere in history during the Stalin dictatorship that he forced Koreans to go to Uzbekistan because they were the world's leading rice producers. Was that a similar reason how they ended up in Kyrgyzstan?
Yeah, exactly. So it was the Koreans sort of who had been originally pushed north into Russia and then had then sort of been pushed or relocated into Kyrgyzstan, similar to Uzbekistan.
During Stalin's?
Yes, exactly. That's exactly the history, as far as I know it. I don't claim to be a historian, but that's how I get it. Yeah.
So I get the kidnapping part, but the bride part I'm not clear about. When the violent part of the kidnapping, can that marriage be annulled, or is there such a thing as divorce? How does a kidnapped woman become a bride?
Yeah.
Is she coerced to take a vow?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a bit of a Hobson's choice that a lot of women face. So if you're kidnapped and if you're kept overnight, there can be a perception in the community that you're no longer a virgin, and then at that point, leaving the marriage can become very difficult. So, by and large, women want to be married. It's traditional and it's status and everything else. And if you are a kidnapped woman who leaves a marriage and you're thought not to be a virgin, maybe some other guy isn't going to want to marry you, and then you never get married, and that's not a desirable outcome for a lot of women. There's a little more complication to it than that. In Kyrgyzstan, it is increasingly becoming the case that women leave. Divorces will happen, but usually after years later. So a woman will stay, have 2 kids with the guy, and then 5 years later they may be a divorce or something. But no, a lot of women stay. A lot of women stay.
Is she coerced into taking a vow?
I mean, this goes back to the corruption question kind of thing. So in Kyrgyzstan, as in Armenia, you have to go get your marriage license. ZOX is the place. A lot of marriages are never made official, and sometimes an imam will be sort of brought in overnight to say a quick whatever something, but it's very off the books in a lot of cases. What really matters is what people in your community think. If people think you're married, you're married. So yeah, that's I could give a longer answer to that, but for time purposes,
Last question.
Yeah.
Related to the same thing as the question about the Koreans, you mentioned there were ethnic Germans there. Is that from Soviet times, Russian times, before that?
I don't know, but yeah, my understanding is mostly from Soviet times. Yeah.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. It was a great honor to have you here.
Okay.